The first is Mircea Eliade's The Sacred and the Profane, published in 1957, and one of the most quietly important books of the 20th century. Eliade was a Romanian historian of religion, and his argument is not theological, it's phenomenological. His claim is that every human culture that has ever existed across every continent, every millennium, without exception, has made a fundamental distinction between two modes of reality, the sacred and the ordinary, not as a belief, but as an experience. The sacred breaks through into life at certain places, certain moments, certain thresholds, and when it does, human beings build around it temples, rituals, calendars, pilgrimage routes, myths handed down across generations. Religion on this reading is not an explanation for thunder, it is the accumulated architecture of an encounter with something real. When I first read that, something shifted, because it meant that what I'd walked away from at 16 was not the sacred itself. It was a specific institutional form, one among many, and not obviously the most spiritually alive, that had been given the monopoly on an experience it didn't own and couldn't contain. The secularization of the modern West in Eliade's frame is not progress, it's amputation. We threw away something we couldn't name because the container it came in had failed us. The second book goes further and into territory that I find more troubling the longer I sit with it. Elaine Pagels' The Gnostic Gospels is built around a discovery made in 1945 when a collection of ancient texts was found buried in the Egyptian desert near Nag Hammadi, hidden from the institutional church for 17 centuries. Pagels is a Princeton scholar of early Christianity, and she examines what those texts reveal, an alternative lineage of Christian spirituality, one centered not on obedience to an external God administered through hierarchy, but on direct interior encounter with the divine, a spark present within each person, accessible through lived experience rather than mediated through clergy and creed. But there is something in those texts that the institution worked even harder to erase than the theology. Mary Magdalene, not the repentant prostitute of medieval tradition. That portrait has no basis in the original sources and was a fabrication, a character assassination sustained across centuries. In the Gospel of Mary, she is the disciple closest to Jesus, the one entrusted with teachings the other apostles had not received, a spiritual authority in her own right. Peter's hostility to her in those texts is not incidental. It's the earliest recorded argument in Christian history about who gets to speak for the sacred, and the side that won was the side with the institutional power but not the spiritual depth. What the church suppressed in Pagels' account was not just an alternative theology, it was the feminine voice within the tradition, the priority of inner experience over outer authority, and the possibility that encounter with the divine was available to any person willing to go inward. That's a very particular kind of violence, and I think Western spiritual life is still carrying the cost of it, largely without really knowing it. I want to say something quickly about my father before I close, because this is not a story about blame. He was doing the most human thing imaginable, reaching for the moral resources he'd been given in a moment of crisis, and trying to pass them on. The problem was not his intention. The problem is that a faith transmitted through obligation rather than living experience cannot do what it needs to do. It cannot produce compliance, it cannot produce transformation, and it can, as it did for me, produce 20 years of spiritual abandonment in someone who was always, it turned out, deeply hungry for the thing it was supposed to offer. Eliade would say that the sacred does not disappear when the container breaks, it waits. Pagels would say that what was buried in the desert for 17 centuries was always going to resurface, because you cannot permanently suppress what is true. I can tell you that for me, the return to the sacred came not through a church but through crisis, through a marriage ending, through intense shadow work and a variety of spiritual ceremonies in multiple traditions that recovered a connection to the sacred that organised religion had severed years before. I recommend both books to anyone who grew up inside organised religion and left, or anyone who's curious about what the tradition was carrying underneath all the doctrine, the dogma and the obligation. The sacred and the profane will change how you read history. The Gnostic Gospels will change how you read Christianity. The question is not whether you believe. The question is what you threw out when you decided that you didn't.